It's wonderful to be here with you, and thank you, Natalie, and the Purina Institute for the invitation to be here. So let's start by just getting an outline of the presentation to orient us. And so I'm going to start by a very brief introduction to immune and inflammatory responses in order to set the stage for the rest of the talk. And then I spend a little bit of time to talk about factors that impact the immune and inflammatory responses, such as aging. And then we get to the impact of nutrition on immune and inflammatory responses. So I don't have to tell this audience that there is very many ways that we can categorize and look at the immune system, but one simple way for me to look at it is to divide it into two parts, the cell-mediated immune response and the inflammatory responses. And we need to have both of these parts of the immune system in order to have an effective immune response to invading pathogens and tumors and so forth. So if you have underperformance of the cell-mediated immune response or a hyporeactive immune response, then there is increase in susceptibility to infection. It can cause into autoimmune diseases, cancer, and arthritis. On the other hand, if you have an uncontrolled chronic inflammatory response, you need to have the inflammatory responses in order to have an effective immune system. But if it is uncontrolled and not controlled after you have mounted the immune response against any pathogens or tumors, then that can cause an uncontrolled inflammatory response like what we had seen in the case of COVID that everyone is now familiar with. And so if that continues to go on, it can result in increased susceptibility to many chronic diseases such as Alzheimer's, neurological disorders, pulmonary diseases, cancer, heart disease, and so forth and so on. Now, there are many factors that can change this balance between the cell-mediated and inflammatory responses, and one of them is aging. And that is becoming more and more important because there is an increase in the number of older population globally. According to WHO, at the moment, globally, 8.5% of the population is over the age of 65. But that number doubles when we look at more developed countries such as US, for example. There's about, at least 19 to 20% of population is over the age of 65. And that seems to be also the case for the companion animals. According to some of the statistics that I've seen, 25% of the dogs and cats are over the age of 8, which is considered to be older adults or older for the dogs and cats. Now, why is that important in terms of immunity? Is because with aging, there is a dysregulation of the immune and inflammatory responses so that you have a decrease in cell-mediated immunity, particularly of the T-cell mediated function, whereas there is an increase in the inflammatory responses. And so this dysregulation results in many of the age-associated diseases that we observe, both across all the species. And I have to say that these changes in immune response is observed in all of the species that have been studied so far, including dogs and cats. So one of the main changes that happens with aging is at the cell-mediated part is a decline in T-cell mediated function. If you look at the different functions that are dependent on T-cell, for example, vaccine efficacy, the function of the T-cells, their ability to kill tumors, their ability to proliferate and produce important cytokines, all of those responses go down with aging. And you can sort of, this information is in humans, but as you can see, with age, there is, as the age increases, there is a decline in the T-cell mediated function. The one thing that I would like you to notice is that it's not like you reach the age of 50 and all of a sudden everything goes haywire. It's a gradual decrease and it's very heterogeneous. So there are some people that are 65 years old and they have an immune system that is as good as 40 years old or younger, and there are those who have a defective system. And that is important. Of course, some of it is related to genetic factors, but I believe that a lot of it has to do with the environmental factors, such as nutrition, things that are controllable. So we're not as defenseless as when it comes to the changes in the immune system. The same is observed actually in terms of the inflammatory responses. You'll see here that, for example, here you're looking at interleukin-6 production, one of the inflammatory cytokines, and you can see that with age there's an increase in the production of the inflammatory cytokines, and again the heterogeneity of the response. And here is a more sort of looking at it in a continuous way, and again you can see that there is heterogeneity and increase in the inflammatory responses. So the same is absorbed in dogs. This is, you can see that with aging, there is a decrease in the cell-mediated immune response when you look at the response of the lymphocytes to mitogens that are sort of, act like antigens or things that you would be exposed to in nature. And this is also observed, for example, in cats. Some of the data that I could find is that you can see, I was happy to see this because you can see the same type of decrease with age and the heterogeneity of the response in terms of the number of, the percentage of the lymphocytes in cats. Here's looking at the ratio of CD4 to CD8. In cats, that goes down with aging. It has been observed in other species, and you can also see here in cats. And again, looking in dogs, you can see the decline in the ratio of the CD4s to CD8. So it's something that is observed across all the species. It's not unique to humans or a particular species. So to sort of summarize all these age-related changes, you can see that many of the cell-mediated responses go down with age, whereas the inflammatory responses go up. And this would result in decrease in vaccine and immune response, and increase in infections and chronic diseases, just to sort of summarize the impact. So now, what about the impact of nutrition on immune and inflammatory responses? So it's been known for many years that nutrients are essential for the function of the immune system. If you have deficiency of any nutrient, maybe except for carbohydrates, you can impair the cell-mediated, all the aspects of the immune response, the impaired cell-mediated immunity, and that would also result in uncontrolled inflammation. On the other hand, and more recently, what we have learned is that when you have overnutrition or obesity, the same thing can happen, that you can have decrease in cell-mediated immunity and increase in inflammation. What is also important is that the pathogen itself can impact the status of nutrients in the body, and I can show you a couple of examples of that. This is looking at the impact of influenza infection on the status of glutathione, ascorbic acid, and vitamin E in the lungs. And you can see that as the animals are exposed to, in this case mice, as they're exposed to influenza, the level of these nutrients, antioxidant nutrients, goes down in the tissue. So it's sort of you're hit in two ways. If you have nutritional deficiencies and then you have an infection, that can result in that can impact the nutritional status very much. Same is observed, for example, with bovine diarrhea virus, which is a member of the coronavirus family, and you can see that with the infection, this is in the virus-free animal, but with the animal who has been infected, you can see a decrease in the level of vitamin E, for example. And the same is also observed with the level of vitamin D when the animals are exposed to the bovine diarrheal virus. So The other side of the nutritional status is obviously overnutrition or obesity, and that is becoming more and more important because, again, 13% of the global population is considered overweight and obese, and that number is much higher actually in countries like US, where close to about 40% of the across all age group are considered to be overweight and obese. And it was very interesting to me to see that there seems to be similar statistics in dogs and cats, where I guess they're eating the same thing as the owners or following the behavior of the owners. So there seems to be about 30 to 40% of dogs and cats are considered obese. And why is that important is because obesity, similar to aging, can cause dysregulation of the immune system, where there is decrease in cell-mediated immunity and an increase in inflammation. And I've been sort of tossing the word accelerated aging when I refer to obesity, because it seems like it gets you into the similar condition. So this is just one example of what happens to the immune system with obesity. This is from our work, where we looked at obese and lean or normal weight mice, and you can see that there is a significant reduction in their ability of their lymphocytes to proliferate, and on one hand, but on the other hand, there's increase in production of the inflammatory cytokines, such as, for example, IL-6 and TNF-alpha. And there's a lot of work that has been conducted. There's decrease in resistance to infection, and a lot more that I would not have time to cover. So how does then nutrition can impact infection and immunity? There are many ways that a change in nutritional status can change your immune response and the ability of the body to resist infection. It can impact pathogen entry by changing the composition of the membrane or essential receptors. It can regulate cell-mediated immune response. It can regulate vaccine efficacy. There is also changes that nutrition can cause in morbidity by regulating the oxidative stress and inflammation, such as what we've seen recently in COVID, case of COVID-19. Nutrition can also reduce pathogen or change the pathogenicity and virulence of a virus. That was demonstrated by work of Dr. Melinda Beck. There is also impact on microbiome through what we eat and the nutritional status that can be very important in terms of regulation of the immunity and resistance to infection. One aspect that I'd like you to keep in mind is that when it comes to nutrition, we think that if there is deficiency and impairment, the more we increase the level of the nutrients, then the better the immune system will get. But that's not necessarily the case. There is an optimal level of nutrients that is needed for optimal function of the immune system. And beyond that, for many nutrients, there actually could be an adverse effect where you could impair the immune and inflammatory responses. So I think that's something to very much be aware of. So I'm going to take some time and talk about some of the nutrients that have been studied in terms of their impact on the immune system. We're going to talk about some of the micronutrients, and then I know that there has been recent interest in plant-based food in terms of the food of the cats and dogs, so I thought it would be interesting to show you some information about that. I was going to go talk about calorie restriction, but I don't think I will have time to do that, but I'm happy to tell you about it later. So one of the nutrients that we and others have done a lot of work with is vitamin E, and actually this work has started in the veterinary work many years ago. They're the ones who initially started looking at impact of vitamin E on immune response, and the focus here has been more on supplementation rather than deficiency, because we know that with deficiency of any micronutrient, you can impair the immune system. So we've done, and others have done many studies both in animal models as well as in humans to show that particularly in the older population, supplementation with higher than recommended level of vitamin E can improve the immune response, the T-cell mediated function, and including responses such as response to vaccines, and then that can result in better protection against infection. But where it's most effective is in the older population. Giving higher level of vitamin E in the younger population does not seem to be very effective in terms of improving immune response unless there is a particular problem, either they're stressed or they're in an environment that impairs their immune system. So this is one example of the work that we've done where we supplemented older adults with different levels of vitamin E, 60, 200, and 800. And then we looked at many different aspects of the immune system, including response to 3 different vaccines, and I'm just showing you the results from the work that looking at hepatitis B vaccine. And as you can see, with the response in the older adults is not what you would expect in the younger adults. It's low. And then with supplementation, we can improve this response, but notice that the optimal level is 200 and not at the 800, the higher level that we looked at. This level was not lower than the placebo, but it was not better than, there's no need to go higher than 200. Similarly, if you look at another T-cell mediated function, what is called the delayed type hypersensitivity skin response, you can see that there's improvement in this response as well following supplementation. So others have, this is also looking in response to infection in mice and looking at the response to influenza infection. You can see that there is when we supplemented the mice with 500 parts per million in the diet of the mice, we can significantly reduce the level of the viral titer in the lung of the of mice. And also you will note that following infection, there's an increase in inflammatory cytokines, but with vitamin E supplementation, we can better control this increase in inflammatory responses. Here you're looking at IL-6, and in this panel, you're looking at the response to TNF-alpha. So it seems to be working both in terms of reducing the viral titer through working through the cell-mediated immunity, but also decreasing perhaps the clinical aspect of the disease through controlling the infection. And I'm not showing the data here, but there was a significant impact in terms of reduction in weight loss due to infection in the mice. So we also have looked at the resistance to infection in humans. We conducted a year-long study, a double-blind, placebo-controlled randomized trial in which we gave the nursing home residents 200 international units per day of vitamin E, which we had determined to be optimal from the previous studies, and then followed them and recorded their respiratory infections. What you can see is that people who were supplemented with vitamin E had 35% less risk of all respiratory infections, and this was mainly in protecting against upper respiratory infections. We did see some effect on pneumonias, but that depended on the genetic background of the subjects, and it was not effective in everyone. So you can see similar impact in dogs and cats. This is from the work of Dr. Chu several years back, where he supplemented young and old dogs and cats with beta-carotene, 20 milligram per kilogram diet. And by the way, we've done studies in human with beta-carotene and see similar impact as well. So you can see that the old dogs have lower ability of the lymphocytes to proliferate, but compared to young. And with beta-carotene supplementation, there's not an impact in the young dogs, but there is a significant improvement in the old dogs. So that seemed to be similar to what we see in humans. And here is looking at another mitogenic response, again, lower in the old dogs, no effect of supplementation, no significant effect anywhere statistically with beta-carotene supplementation, but there is an improvement in the old dogs in this response as well. And this is looking at the percent of T helper cells, which, by the way, goes down with aging. You can see that there's not much of an effect with beta-carotene supplementation, and that's not unusual. Nutrition seems to be impacting mostly the function of the cells rather than the profile of the cell, unless there is extreme deficiency or extreme cases where the percentage of the cells or the profile of the cells changes. But the impact seems to be mostly on function of the cells. So zinc was mentioned before, and it's a very important nutrient for many functions, but particularly for the immune system. Zinc deficiency can cause havoc in the immune system. And there's been a lot of interest then in looking at zinc because zinc deficiency is prevalent around the world. And also not just in the less developed countries, but also in developed countries. And this sort of risk of being at risk for zinc deficiency is observed across all age groups, particularly in children, in adolescent females, and what we have shown more recently in older adults. And as I said, it's not just specific to less developed countries. It's observed in other countries as well. And there's been a lot of interest in zinc because of its role in immune function, particularly in children and pneumonia. And there have been several meta-analyses that have been observed, and it is, and most of the studies that have been done do see an effect of zinc supplementation in populations that have low zinc status in terms of reducing the risk for respiratory infections. And as I said, this has been confirmed by several meta-analyses. So we were interested in looking in the older population, and in a way, it happened by chance because when we were doing the vitamin E study, to be careful and make sure that the effect that we're seeing is because of vitamin E and not changing other nutrients, we did look at the blood level of all the other nutrients that were important for immune function, and one of them was zinc. And to my surprise, we found that 30% of the nursing home residents in US had low zinc status, which I was not expecting at all. And then we did another study with my former student, Dr. Coleman, and we found that 22% of independently living older population had low serum zinc level. And we have actually repeated this finding in a more recent study where we are finding actually a higher percent to be having low serum zinc level, which was, interesting. And what was interesting was that by itself, maybe it's not important, but what we found was that the older adults who had low serum zinc level had twice as much pneumonia during the 1 year observation that we made. You can see here people who have low serum zinc level in terms of incidence of pneumonia compared to those who have adequate zinc level. They had higher duration of pneumonia as well as more antibiotic prescription and more duration of antibiotic use. I mean, this is obviously observation and needs to be confirmed in a prospective study, but I think it was a large population, 600 people, so I think it's important. So in order to do an actual a prospective study and look at the impact of zinc on pneumonia, we wanted to look at, first defined the adequate level of zinc supplementation. So it did a study where we supplemented subjects who had low serum zinc level with 30 milligram per day of zinc for 3 months, and then looked at their serum zinc level and some of the T-cell mediated function. And what we found was that, it's going forward rather than backward. Okay. And what we found was that with supplementation, we could improve zinc status of majority of the people with 30 milligram per day, and those people had better T-cell mediated function. We're now conducting another study because 30 milligram wasn't adequate to improve the response in all the subjects, only in 65% of them. So we're now doing a year-long study where we're supplementing subjects with 30 and 60 milligrams zinc per day and looking at their zinc status and some of the immune parameters to determine the safe and adequate level of zinc supplementation before we do a large trial to look at pneumonia. And I want to emphasize that sometimes you see a lot of controversy in nutritional studies and immune function, and I think it's because it's hard to take time to do the proper steps before you actually look at, for example, infection. Or usually we all tend to use the highest level of nutrient and not considering the optimal level might not be the highest level, and so it becomes very controversial. Another nutrient that has generated a lot of interest is vitamin D, and vitamin D is also essential for the function of the immune system, and a majority of the work has been focused on actually autoimmune diseases. That's where vitamin D seems to be working, regulating the subsets of T cells that are involved in autoimmune disease, and it seems to be very effective in terms of controlling autoimmune diseases, at least in the animal models. There was a lot of interest generated about vitamin E because it was shown to increase the expression of antibacterial proteins, there has been observations, at least some, that low serum vitamin D level is associated with higher respiratory infection. So this, combined with the fact that vitamin D can increase the expression of antibacterial proteins, generated a lot of interest in looking at vitamin D and respiratory infections. But I have to say that the results have been a bit disappointing. I mean, there's a lot of, you don't need to see all the information here, but it's just to show you that when they have conducted, many trials have been conducted, but overall there doesn't seem to be an effect of vitamin E in terms of reducing respiratory infections, and that might have to do with some of the shortcomings of the methodologies used, but overall it's not very impressive when it comes to impact of vitamin D. And I do have some concern about vitamin D suppressing, if it's given in a high level to suppress T-cell mediated function. I think it's effective in terms of autoimmune diseases and perhaps inflammation, but not so much for some of the other parts of the immune system. Another nutrient is vitamin C that has generated a lot of interest, but overall I have to say that the result of the studies that have been done so far have been a bit disappointing. While vitamin E is needed for the function of the immune cell, the studies that have been done in terms of looking at the immune system have been controversial, and they have been hampered by several methodological shortcomings. And I've listed some of the methodological shortcomings that have contributed to the controversy about vitamin C and immune response. So I would say when I look at the totality of the evidence, whether it's because of the shortcoming of the studies that have been done or lack of effect, it's not very impressive when it comes in terms of using higher level of vitamin E and preventing infections, for example, or colds and so forth. Some positive results, but not always. So I want to finish by sharing with you some information about plant-based food, again, because I think there seems to be an interest in feeding dogs and cats by the owners, at least in terms of plant-based food. So we have done studies looking at fruits and vegetables because they contain several classes of bioactive compounds that including polyphenols, vitamins, and minerals that can reduce reactive oxygen species, inflammations, and also improve cell-mediated function. We did a series of preclinical studies in animal models using a mixture of 24 fruits and vegetables that are commonly consumed in US, and we looked at immune and inflammatory responses, gut microbiome, and health and lifespan of normal weight and obese mice. So the first study was looking at the impact of this mixture of fruits and vegetables on inflammation, immunity, and gut microbiome, and also on non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which is a problem with obesity. Just a very brief look at the design of the study. It was a 20-week study. We fed animals either a low or a high-fat diet, and again, you don't need to, these are published, so you can get the information, but this is just to show you that we used a low-fat and a high-fat diet and supplemented these diets with different levels of mixture of fruits and vegetables from 5 to 15%, which is equivalent to about 0 to 7 or 8 servings of fruits and vegetables in humans. And you can convert it to cats and dogs in your heads if you would like. But this is the point of this, is to show that in terms of macronutrients, these diets were all similar. So the effect that we're seeing is not because of a difference in protein level or fat level. What is different basically between them is the amount of total antioxidants, polyphenols, and things like carotenoids and so forth. So just to orient you, this is looking at the effect of the low fat. This is in the low animals who were fed the low fat diet, B0, B5, 10. This is the percent of the fruits and vegetable. Impact on weight, you can see in the normal weight animals, there's no impact on weight. And here you can see it as well. But when we give it with a high-fat diet, which causes obesity, you can see that this mixture can significantly reduce weight gain at the 15% level. So that seems to be the most effective. And also at the 10%, there is a significant reduction in weight gain. You can see this also here in this format. And the impact seems to be on reducing the fat deposit. We do see a significant reduction in when we look at the BMI and body composition. There is higher muscle mass and lower body fat. This is looking at inflammatory serum cytokine levels in the animals that are fed the normal fat, and you can see that there is significant reduction in inflammatory cytokine, and the same is seen when the animals are given the high-fat diet. Here's is looking at the cell-mediated function, just one aspect of it. With obesity, there's significant reduction in the ability of the lymphocytes to proliferate. When we give the high-fat diet with the mixture of fruits and vegetables, we don't see that suppression. So it's the fruits and vegetables is capable of preventing the suppression that it is induced by a high-fat diet in cell-mediated immunity. And we do see some effect in terms of the percentage of the cells as well. So just to summarize, this mixture of the fruits and vegetables is capable of having an impact in terms of weight when it's given with the high-fat diet. the most efficient level was 15% in terms of the mixture, and the effect was most dramatic in obese compared to normal weight animals, although we do see impact in the normal weight. Of interest to the clinicians, with obesity, there is non-alcoholic fatty liver disease that is produced, and you can see this here, pretty obvious, the accumulation of fat in the liver of the obese animals compared to the animals who are given the low fat. When we give the high-fat diet with this mixture of fruits and vegetables, there's a significant reduction in the accumulation of fat in the liver. And I'll show you some data later, and that's a risk factor for cancer, and I'll show you some data on incidence of cancer as well. So there are many different ways that that fruits and vegetables can exert their health benefit. They can reduce oxidative stress and inflammation. They can also cause lipidomic changes, such as in eicosanoids and sphingolipids, which are a group of lipids that have been shown to have pro-inflammatory effects as well as many other things and be involved in increasing the risk for cancer and so forth. And the two are actually related to each other. And another way is through changing the gut microbiome. And I'll show you just a couple of pieces of data that shows you the potential mechanism. This is looking at the level of these sphingolipids, particularly ceramides, that have been shown to be pro-inflammatory and also to be involved in cardiovascular disease, in cancer, and so forth. And you can see that both in the low-fat and in the high-fat diet, feeding the mixture of fruits and vegetables can decrease the level of ceramide. And the different species of ceramide, because there are different species of ceramides, but it's effective in decreasing several of them, but not all of them, as well as the total ceramide. And also, when we look at the gut microbiome, this is just looking at the diversity of the gut microbiome. This is in the animals who are fed the low-fat diet. You can see that there is an increase in diversity of the gut microbiome by feeding this mixture. And this is in the animals who were fed the high-fat diet. And again, you can see this is the high-fat animals in the high-fat diet. This is the low-fat diet, and this is the animals who were given the high-fat diet with the mixture of fruits and vegetables. So there seems to be the reshaping of the gut microbiome. I don't have time to show you the data. It's published. You can see the specific changes that occurs in the gut microbiome by giving the fruits and vegetables. So the other study that we did was looking at the incidence of atherosclerosis in animals who were given a high-fat, high-cholesterol diet to induce atherosclerosis in mice. And what you can see is that with the high-fat feeding, there is significant increase in plaque formation in the arteries. But when you give the high-fat diet with the mixture of fruits and vegetables, there is a significant reduction in the plaque formation. And that is associated with changes in serum lipid levels, including in HDL and LDL, and also in inflammatory cytokines. And we also, similar to what we saw in wild-type mice, there is changes in the gut microbiome. And again, the studies have been published, and so you can look at the specific. So to summarize, this plant-based mixture of fruits and vegetables seems to have several beneficial effects in terms of reducing inflammation, both when it's given with a normal fat diet and with a high-fat diet, but the effect is a lot more dramatic when it's given with the high-fat diet, and it seems to reduce inflammation and the suppression that is caused by the high-fat diet in cell-mediated immunity, and also the impact of this mixture appears to be mediated through reducing inflammation, particularly this class of lipids called ceramides, and also reshaping the gut microbiome. Currently, we're conducting experiments to determine the importance of each of these, whether, how important are ceramides versus the gut microbiome in terms of the effects that we're seeing by doing by looking at inhibitors of ceramides, by looking at other ways of changing the gut microbiome, and then also transferring the content of the gut from animals that are given the high fruits and vegetables to the animals who don't have it. So we're in the midst of doing these studies currently. So because the short-term studies were very encouraging, and we're very interested in impact of nutrition on longevity, we did a study where we fed a low or a high-fat diet with and without this mixture from the time the mice were 1 month old until the first group reached median lifespan, to see whether there's an impact on longevity and some of the diseases that are associated with aging. Just again, the study has been recently published, so I will just show you a couple of slides from that study. This is looking at survival rate in mice. You can see that the animals who are given the high-fat diet are the first group that reached 50% survival. But when we give this mixture, when we give the high-fat diet with the mixture of fruits and vegetables, there's significant reduction in mortality. These mice survive much better. Their survival rate was 50% better than the ones who were given the high-fat diet alone. There's some effect when it's given with the low-fat diet, about 10% difference, but this did not reach a statistical significance. So again, it seems to be more effective when it's given the high-fat diet. And here's looking at the incidence of tumors, which were mainly liver tumors, as would be expected because of the type of diet. You can see that the high-fat diet has significantly higher level. Animals who are given the high-fat diet have significantly higher level of tumors compared to those who are given the low-fat diet. We don't see an impact of the mixture in terms of incidence of cancer in the animals who are given the low-fat diet, but there's a significant 23% reduction in cancer incidence in animals who are given the high-fat diet with this mixture. So there's 23% reduction in cancer, but 50% reduction in mortality. So obviously the mixture is having other impacts on the animals than cancer only. So to summarize, this last piece of data on fruits and vegetables indicates that feeding fruits and vegetables throughout the life is beneficial in terms of increasing longevity and also the health span of animals. It's obviously more effective in terms of when it's given with a Western-style high-fat diet than when we're giving a very low-fat diet, but it does also have beneficial effect even with the low-fat diet, and the impact of the fruits and vegetables seems to be mediated to reducing inflammation and also changing the composition of the gut microbiome, although we don't know how important each of these aspects are. And the two of them might be related to each other because there's a relationship between the ceramides and the gut microbiome and so forth. And finally, to finish, I hope that I've shown you some indication that immune and inflammatory responses are important in maintaining normal bodily function and protecting against diseases, and that, excuse me, normal immune and inflammatory responses are influenced by many factors such as aging and nutrition. Both under and overnutrition can dysregulate the immune response and change the the resistance of a person or animal to infection, and proper nutrition intervention can optimize the trajectory of immune and inflammatory diseases and lead to a longer and healthier life. Thank you so much for your attention.